Talent acquisition and recruitment is fundamentally changing. And joining me is somebody who's seen that change from the late 90s all the way through to the present time. And during the conversation, what we've explored isn't necessarily all these nitty-gritty changes, but more specifically, the underlying skills that we as talent acquisition professionals can harvest and develop in order to be successful regardless of what's being thrown at us in the next few years. Here is a little snippet from this conversation.
So we start with a role. What's that impact or value that role is supposed to have? What are the impact pillars? What are the pillars in which that role can have an impact? What are then the skills and competencies that we're looking for in that role? And then plugging those in and saying, okay, can you give us some ideas, for example, on where we could possibly find those? Can you help us build out a persona around those skills, right? And then playing with the AI, and then as an output of that, then also asking, okay, what would a good advertising or what language could, but that's really a process, right? So we thought actually what we should be doing is a risk assessment of that hire. We should be asking ourselves, based on the process that we've run and the feedback that we got around what we wanted in that person, how does our process stand up to it, and how does the information that we've collected stand up to it? And what's the risk that we're taking, right? Or the trade-offs that we need to make in order to properly understand who we're hiring.
This genuinely is one of my favorite conversations, not just because of the content that Joanna shares, but deep rooted inside this for the first time is an extremely clear and practical example of how critical thinking, artificial intelligence, and talent acquisition converge into a real world application that has supported the development of SumUp. That is unbelievably impactful, and I really do hope that you get just as much out of this conversation as I did when I recorded it. Thank you so much for sticking around, and enjoy the episode. Welcome to Tea Time with Talent Acquisition, the podcast aimed at fostering knowledge and sharing stories within the vibrant talent acquisition community. I'm your host, Eden, and for the next hour or so, I'm going to be joined by a truly incredible guest. Throughout her 25-year career to date, she's developed a track record of building high-performing teams and driving innovation through hiring strategies for some top companies from here, Weissman, and now with the fintech team in Berlin, SumUp. With a passion for creating exceptional candidate experiences and optimizing the recruitment process, she's helped these top companies attract and retain the best talent, but more importantly, helped those that she's led flourish within their careers. So when you're ready, grab your favorite tea or coffee if you prefer, and welcome today's guest, the Global Head of TA for SumUp, Joanna Pysden. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eden. It's my privilege to be here today. Thank you.
You don't have to say that. It's fine. No, but I do mean your career is extremely impressive and expansive as well through many different phases of what this whole talent acquisition journey has been part of. But what we want to talk about today is the core fundamentals that are going to make a successful career in recruitment, no matter if we're in the current more technologically advanced stage of what we're doing to hopefully what's in the next 10 years and beyond. So before we get into the nitty gritty, I do like to ask everyone the same question. So from your perspective, Joanna, what makes a high performing recruitment team?
So I think it's the answer is kind of it's not necessarily specific to TA, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's really about driving ownership first of all. So I'm not a huge fan of these kind of hierarchical thinking, right? I think you should be transparent about what your value add is, right? What your value proposition is to the business that you're serving. And that can look different from company to company, right? I think that should be transparent to the team. I think the team should understand how they can contribute with their individual skills, capabilities, competencies towards that proposition. And I think maybe one of the most interesting things is that I think you almost have to move away from functional thinking, right? And think instead in terms of value, right? Sure, as a TA, you have certain experiences, skills, capabilities that will contribute that value. But I think if you stick very much to the problem or the opportunity that you see within the business and the value that you can bring to it, you can also drive a lot of innovation, right? So it's really pivoting away from functional thinking, thinking about value add, understanding the problem or the opportunity that you're targeting, and really trying to create a shared ownership model within your team to drive that agility, creativity, and so on. Yeah.
So it's less about having that, we've got a brilliant sourcer, a brilliant closer, but having people who understand what they're good at, but being able to kind of share that within a well-rounded team. And so you're not just having, not going to market and saying, okay, we're hiring for our team. We need to find the best closer out there to build. That's the last piece of the puzzle we need.
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger with that strategy, right, is that what good looks like changes over time, right? So even if you're talking about going out and hiring the best possible people for your team, I really like to hire in terms of potential, right? And that has a lot to do with mindset for starters, right? And it's not saying also that you don't need that talent within your team. I'm just saying that shouldn't define your approach, right? And I think you need to separate those two things out to some degree, right? So what are we trying? What's the value that we're trying to bring? What's the opportunity or the challenge within the business? How do we then leverage all those skills, all those roles, all those experiences that we have within our team in order to deliver towards that? And actually, one of a mentor of mine, or somebody I used to work with, there was also a mentor. She was leading our people team, once said to me, there's a difference between an organizational structure and an operating model, right? And I think when you talk about functionally TA, sometimes we talk a little bit like you just described, right? That we have a sourcer, we have 5 recruiters, we have these number of roles. But I think it's important to move more towards the operating model thinking, right? So actually, what do we need to deliver? Is there a bigger focus on outbound or inbound? How do we structure the team? What skills, competence, experiences do we need to bring in, right, in order to bring that to fruition, right, rather than thinking classically? Yeah.
And I think that kind of leads quite nice into what we want to talk about today, which is, us as talent acquisition professionals.
Yeah.
And you as a leader in this space, obviously you're thinking in a certain way that we don't always necessarily know what everyone's thinking, when we're trying to go for opportunities in our career. So it's about laying the foundations of our own success. Mm-hmm. So when you first spoke to me about this topic, I was kind of curious because, we always talk about skills and we always talk about competencies, and I think everyone kind of has a grasp to some degree, but obviously you went to go in a bit more of a granular detail and kind of really express examples that you've seen throughout your career. So when you refer to the topic of what we're talking about, which is laying the foundations for your own success in talent acquisition, what does that actually mean to you?
So, I mean, I think about things quite systematically, right? So whenever I would go into a company, I would do exactly what I just described, right? So really try to understand, where is the business going, right? What's the lay of the land, right? What kind of skills are we focusing on? How does our brand perform, right? In able to attract those skills or certain competencies, capabilities, and so on from the market. And really kind of try to understand then how to address those challenges. I think a very important component also is that what's the state of the team, right? Because actually fundamentally people are the most important success factor, right? I think sometimes companies tend to underestimate that, right? That's your biggest, what's the word I'm looking for? Your biggest,
Asset?
well, yeah, lever for success, right? So really understanding where they at, how well do they understand those issues, like how they're able to contribute to that, right? So what's the level of skill or experiences and so on that they bring to the table, and how can we kind of unleash the potential of that team in being able to solve those challenges, right?
Mhm.
So it's kind of, this is usually systematically the way that I go about it. I mean, how you then execute on that, right? How you bring it to life. I don't think there's some kind of formulaic plan. And I think that's also the responsibility of a senior global leader, right? To really understand all those nuances, understand where your levers are, understand who your important stakeholders are. But one thing I do try to make sure of is to make sure that we deliver value as quickly as possible with any change that we bring, right? That the business sees that there's a difference, even if it's small, right? That they see and feel that difference as quickly as possible, even if you're changing things in the background.
I think that value add element,
Yeah.
that doesn't matter if you're a leader of, in your case, quite a large global team, or if you're the only recruiter inside a business. I think that's something you can be felt throughout as long as we're driving value in our role.
Yeah.
Where do you feel as an industry, the talent community is on your kind of idea of thinking?
So I think, I started a long time in a galaxy, long time ago, right? So I started in recruiting in the 1990s, actually, towards the very end, and also in Japan, where headhunting as a concept was actually a very new kind of concept, right? To go and steal or engage talent from other companies. And I've seen how the industry has evolved. One trend that concerns me a little bit is, especially now with the emergence of AI, is how we build our own skill within TA, right? Because I see a lot of movement in the market, but also within very small bubbles, right?
Okay.
So, for example, a common movement you'll see is people moving from agency into in-house, or not at all having agency experience and going from in-house to in-house, and then thinking, okay, I'll go to this company because maybe they'll offer me more money, or it's a better brand, or right. And what I've experienced, especially within the Berlin economy, is that this fast movement, right, which is kind of driven by our own interest, sometimes I feel that we don't give it enough time to develop or evolve skills within the current context that we're operating in, right? And for me, there's always positives and negatives in any company that you join, right?
Mhm.
It's always a learning curve. Short of the company going out of business, right? There are always ways that we can add value and learn through that. And I think for me, what I would wish is that it's not patience really, but it's really the commitment to that learning curve, right? That we continue to evolve, understand, okay, what's possible, what don't we know, how could we use this opportunity more, and try to suck the learning opportunity out of it, without moving too fast, right?
Wouldn't the
Yeah.
argument be though that by moving from a 50-person company to a 250-person company, there's all those learns that you're going to have with that? Or is your argument
Yes,
that
it's
we're
true.
doing it
I
too soon?
understand. I understand that the exposure is different, right? So the problem or the opportunity is different. But you're again kind of pressing reset the reset button, right?
Yeah.
So you're going through that whole learning curve from beginning, right? And then getting to the point where you can start to experience those things. And my argument is, to some degree, and I'm not saying people have to stay for 5 or 10 years, but at least give it a few years, right? Is that there's always something to learn, even if you can't see it, right? And I think it's also a personal reflection that needs to happen, right, before you take that decision, which is also part of learning, right? To be able to reflect on yourself and understand what is it that I'm not seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think giving that extra time, I know this is in the context of boosting your own career in general, and laying the foundations
Yeah.
of it, is if you're primed then better to support your next business, you're likely to have a better opportunity for all those elements you might be taking the short switch for, the salary, the title, the responsibilities, whatever. But by staying put for a little bit longer, learning more, you can almost secure better opportunities long term.
Yeah, I think, with every learning curve, there's an element of resilience attached to it, right? So we're in a company and we say, okay, this is not working how I thought it would, right? And then we start to look externally and we say, okay, but there I could probably learn. But you're making an assumption, just as you're making an assumption about staying where you are is not real, because how could you have explored, there's a level of exploration that needs to happen. Also things that we don't know. We don't know what we don't know, right? That I think needs to happen before you can really truly say, like, I've totally, learned all there is to learn. And also, if it's a difficult situation, there's also something to be learned in that, right? Or something that's uncomfortable to us, stepping outside of our comfort zone and saying, okay, this is not what I enjoy. This is not what I like to do. But that also then builds certain sensibilities in us that can support also our longer term trajectory. And I don't want people now to write in and say, oh my God, this is so she's saying we should stay.
We're
I'm
witch
not
hunting you.
saying
What are you
to
talking about? We've
stay.
already done it. I've already created the posts on LinkedIn. Your name's
Yeah, I
being
can
branded out
imagine,
there.
right?
You're never working in Berlin
Probably
again.
saying that I started my career in the 1990s, people probably think I belong to, probably it's a little bit of an old-fashioned view. But I can also tie it to other topics like AI and why I think it's important that we, and I do believe that we can build certain essential capabilities and competencies pretty much in most environments, right? If we persist and try to challenge ourselves on our own thinking. Yeah. And I'm not saying stay 3, 5, I'm not saying stay 5 or 10 years at the same time. I would also not advocate for that, right? But at least what I see 6 months, 1 year, whatever, you need time is basically what I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to talk about some of these skills and competencies. And you mentioned the AI one. So let's start there. Because you have a very interesting example that we spoke about the other week.
Yeah.
And I said to you before, I mean, one of the topics I have when I speak to teams about AI is that, ultimately, that I'm yet to see much truth around things that they've implemented that are actually working, other than, hey, use ChatGPT to do this, or use this AI note taker. I mean, great. But you brought up an example to me that it blew my mind. I was like, holy shit, that is a real world application.
Yeah.
That you're showing that you're bringing value to the business. So if it's cool, I'm going to shut up. I want you to explain a little bit more about what the team have done. And then hopefully if someone's listening, they're going to go and try and copy as much as they can.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to remember, and this is also, touching on skills in TA and how we build up our knowledge and actually competencies. I think the first thing to remember is that AI is a kind of power suit, right? So the output that you get from it is very much dependent on who's the operator, right? So somebody once talked about that Iron Man analogy, right, with the whole suit on, and I do see it also in recruiting, like based on who's doing the inputting, right? The output is completely different. So there is no, and one of the critical elements here, and this is also where I fear a little bit in this age where we have information readily available to us, is that it does require a certain critical thinking, right?
Right.
So to really harness the power of AI, you need to be able to critically evaluate, right, what's being pushed out to you and trigger the right questions or input, right, input output, right, to get a really qualitative output from AI. Actually, you're a kind of trainer as well. You're in that training seat, right? And again, it touches a little bit on what you were saying, Eden, right? That you talked about building our skills and so on. It does, experience and knowledge and things do matter. What worries me nowadays is that we're an information-driven society, right? So we're on Facebook or Insta or Meta or TikTok or wherever, and we're just being fed information, right? But we haven't gone through the process of trying to get to that information. We don't have to go through that
Bypassed all
process
that
anymore,
research
right?
ourselves.
Right? It's just given to us, right? And that's also the danger with disinformation, right? So I wanted to make that point, right? That going through that exploration, a bit tied to my earlier point about staying and exploring the opportunity that you're in, right? Builds kind of this critical evaluation skill, builds the experiences and so on. Then fast track into your answering your question directly. So we've, uncovered a number of use cases, but I want to highlight one which also talks a little bit about the way we think in TA, right? So in typical TA functions, we think, okay, we're going to do sourcing, we're going to do a kickoff, we're going to source, we're going to assess, we're going to debrief, we're going to hire, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we had a conversation about was specifically at the debrief stage, we asked ourselves, what's the objective of that call actually, right? So what are we trying to achieve? Take away the regular functional approach and process thinking, right? Thinking instead, okay, why do we have that step? Because at the end of the day, a process should support an outcome, right? And not the other way around. And we recognize that, we use that call basically to discuss if we should be making that hire.
Mm-hmm.
And we turned that a little bit on its head and said, okay, but it's still very biased because in the end, it's an opinion, right? Okay, we maybe have well-trained interviewers that understand how to do, that recognize they're aware of their own bias, they're able to do really good objective interviewing and are qualified in that sense. But at the end of the day, it's still very much, there's still the person in there, right? That's stating an opinion. So we thought actually what we should be doing is a risk assessment of that hire, right? We should be asking ourselves, based on the process that we've run and the feedback that we got around what we wanted in that person, how does our process stand up to it, and how does the information that we've collected stand up to it? And what's the risk that we're taking, right? Or the trade-offs that we need to make in order to properly understand who we're hiring. Yeah. And that was very powerful. We tested it a couple of times, and actually the recruiter came out with a number of questions that were not covered, right? So we put in all the input. We got of course, we anonymized it before we get more calls, right? We anonymized it and so on. And we got these outputs, and it basically called into question the fact that we hadn't assessed a certain dimension, right, or skill. It also showed the opportunities of this hire, but also where there were still potential risks or development gaps. And so it really enriched that conversation, and even more powerfully, it really helped us understand who we were hiring and how we could better enable them, right? So we will be taking that further. There are a number of other use cases as well, but that for me was one of the more interesting ones. Yeah.
So just to backpedal a little bit. So you're collecting this data from the interviews that your recruiters are having, your hiring panels are having. So it's relying on good quality notes being taken in the first place for us to actually take that information. And then you're feeding it or prompting it into. Do you have an AI system that you built internally to do this, or are you using ones that are readily available?
Yeah, you can create AIs as well. So we're looking at doing that, right? Training and inputting as well. I think one of the reasons we also did it is because it really evaluates our assessment capability, right? There are some tools out there that we're exploring right now to do that also in real time as part of the interviews, right? To really say that this, to take the notes, for example, in real time, so it's completely objective, right? That it's nobody's translating something in their head and writing something that they thought they heard, right? There's no perception in it. And then that can do that automatically as well. But in the absence of paying and implementing all these tools, we just took a shot to try that ourselves, to basically assess the quality of the interview based on the quality of the notes, to understand the risks there, and then to also understand where we had potential gaps, and then also looking at the profile and the feedback that we did have. What are the opportunities to develop that person, and what are the trade-offs that we need to accept in taking that decision?
Was that a formula that you had created as a team, to get that final risk assessment, or was it just a bit more
we just
kind
tried.
of
We tried. We had a conversation. We tried it on the executive level because often on executive level, the stakeholders are super busy, right? And I think with executives, they tend to go a lot more, even more with their gut because of their experience and also time constraints. They tend to have culminated a lot of experience themselves, and so there's this kind of experience bias, if you like, right, that plays a role. And also they don't have a lot of time. And we thought inviting them to a debrief and listening around and then taking that information, digesting it, it was also a shortcut measure for us to really get to the point that we needed to really discuss. So, yeah, we tried it with the leadership, and actually we want to scale that further now.
When you shared it to me, I was literally sat back thinking there's such a practical way to utilize tools that we all now have access to. That's not just a carbon copy of put a job description in there and let it write it for you. But it's something that's measuring critical work. It's the element of critical thinking towards our process for the betterment of the company.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
That's the application.
That is exactly. I mean, even with job, and I just want to go back again to this critical thinking piece, right? Even with writing job adverts, as I like to call them, because I think what we get is a kind of description, and then you need to transform that into a job ad. What does that actually entail? It means understanding your target group and building out a persona, right? And all that is actually quite a lot of work. And this is where AI can actually help us speed that whole process up, right? So we start with a role. What's that impact or value that role is supposed to have? What are the impact pillars? What are the pillars in which that role can have an impact? What are then the skills and competencies that we're looking for in that role? And then plugging those in and saying, okay, can you give us some ideas, for example, on where we could possibly find those? Can you help us build out a persona around those skills, right? And then playing with the AI, and then as an output of that, then also asking, okay, what would a good advertising or what language could, but that's really a process, right?
Yeah.
It's not just plugging in a description saying, write a good advert. It's again going through those steps and understanding that they're necessary to get a really good output.
I think the persona part is wildly underutilized. I've not had a single team give me a persona for any job description I've ever worked. I've had to build them myself, and I find that mental because we use them all the time.
Yeah.
And obviously we have essentially like cheat sheet ones now where I've had to build so many of them.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, I've got my go-to. I know roughly where your fintech people sit, where this person sits,
Yeah.
where if you want to find it, you kind of get familiar with it. But I find it's such an underutilized element that's prompt engineering like it should be. Who's the competitors of SumUp? Where what industries kind of correlate closer to what you're doing and to build that knowledge up.
Yeah.
You used the phrase to me before, I believe it's the go-to-market strategy.
Yeah. It's a
In
bit
talent
like
acquisition.
products, really, isn't it? And that's how we think about it as well here. So we've started with like job placing, right? And it is a product. A job is a product, right? So we really do, and that's why the personas are so important. But Eden, what you're saying is really that we've become very transactional, right? And this goes back right to the initial point that I made, that if you're just getting a job description, posting it, using AI or a gender decoder and saying, I've done my job as a recruiter, you are being transactional. And if you're worried about modern technology, then you should be if you're transactional, because that is something literally that we could automate in future, right? What we can't automate is exactly that thinking process that helps us target the right, exactly the right persona on the market, which then means that we get a better quality of response, a higher ROI on our investments, a more efficient recruiting
everything benefits from it,
and a much happier business, right? So we have to, and that also then we touched just now on funnel metrics, right? Understanding your conversion and saying, okay, I have a 10% or whatever. Like if you don't understand how to influence that as a recruiter, then how can you possibly train an AI to support you with that, right? So, yeah.
I think it all boils down to that's the value add of where we're now moving our careers to.
Yeah.
And that's,
absolutely.
I mean, I bang the same drum all the time. It's business partner, not a service partner. I mean, that's regardless if you work in-house, external, RPOs, you should always be business partners. We should fundamentally looking at talent acquisition and recruitment as a business element, not a service element, in my opinion.
But I think we should go a step further, honestly. I think we should stop thinking so functionally, right? Skills have become very fluid, just like everything else nowadays, right? They're also very fluid. Like you can, if you're very experienced, for example, in data and analytics, and we've seen that use case also within TA in my teams, right? Where we've had somebody who's super experienced with data moving then into the data area, right? And working purely in that area. I think the danger with thinking functionally nowadays is that you restrict yourself in terms of the solutions that you're able to bring to the table, and you limit your own learning through that. Yeah. And that's why I also said it's important to think in terms of what's the challenge, to invite and co-create across functionally, right? So one of the other issues I often encounter is this kind of siloed mentality between functions, even within people or HR, right? So we're thinking, I'm an HR business, this is my task. I'm a TA, this is my task, right? But if we thought in terms of, again, what's the value or the problem that we need to solve for our business, and came together and co-created, we could invent or ideate some much better solutions, I think, than if we just stick to what we know and get tied to our function, and then harness all our skills and all our potential in actually doing that. Yeah. So I think in future these functions will dissipate slowly.
Who drives this from your perspective? Should it come down to us as the individual recruiter, talent acquisition specialist, as our, come into the business, say that this is how I think we should, start working, or however you want to phrase it, or should it be driven by the leader?
So I think you should always lead by example, right? So, and it doesn't matter if you're a leader or not. Like I often, we all come with a different toolbox to the table. And it's the job of the leader to understand what that toolbox that each individual has and how to leverage or develop that, right? And that's also why I don't like hierarchies, because often we think then the leaders have all the answers, and that's absolutely not the case, right? The leaders are there to enable and unleash that power within their teams. So I think if you are able to do it, it doesn't matter where you sit in the organization, you should definitely take and lead by example. And that's why I also like this idea of creating transparency on what we need to influence, and then allowing for this freedom, right, that people can innovate and contribute to that within their individual situations, as best they can, come with ideas. And this really drives agility throughout your team, rather than sitting here and saying, this is how we're going to do it. Right?
I mean, it's easier coming from an environment, and to interject, where clearly you are a leader that believes this ethos, and you're driving it into your team. Obviously, you feel supported by the company to do that as well.
Yeah.
Right? So there is the argument again where a lot of individuals are seen in businesses where maybe they are trying to push things forward and they're trying to change it, but it is resistance from an older mentality perspective, or however you want to call it. And that's from the business and from leaders. So to those who are listening and wholeheartedly saying, I believe in what you're saying, what would you encourage that they try to start moving that needle?
So I think there's resistance everywhere. I think it's just different types of resistance. I can't say that when you come into a new company and there's a need for transformation, why hasn't it happened? Clearly, because there's some level of resistance, right? Whether it's and you can define resistance how you want. It could be that people either don't get it, don't want it, right? Are not motivated, right? So I think resistance exists anywhere. And I think in order to counter that, it's really going back to the main thing about showing value and having an agreement or alignment on what value looks like on a base level, right? And it doesn't matter if people's attitude towards creating that is different. It takes all kinds, and I'm a huge believer in inclusivity, right? Like even people that maybe we would term as coming from an older style corporate environment, whatever, even that perspective matters, because maybe they understand what scaling looks like or whatever, right? So, but I think the main denominator here, or the common ground, is that we have to align on what's the value, and do we all agree that that's the value we want to deliver? I think if a leader or a company then comes back and says, and what the cost of that is, I should add, right? Mm-hmm. And then if a leader or a company comes back and says, I don't agree with that, at least you have a baseline for saying, okay, but these are your options now, right? We can do it like this, and this will deliver this. So sometimes I think we also have a very black and white mentality on this is the right way to do it, this is not the right. And it's really about opening the door to having these more these richer conversations, right? By allowing for options, but really uniting everyone around the value that you're trying to bring. Yeah. Does that make sense? I'm
It
not sure.
does. It does. And I think it's a different mentality for what a lot of
Yeah.
people probably are used to.
Yeah.
If someone does want to pick the conversation up with you further, where is the best place that they can find you?
Well, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, no problem. I mean, I'm always up to chat. I mean, I say that, but I also don't know about your followership and how many connection requests but please drop me a line on LinkedIn. I can't promise that I'll get back within 24 hours or even 48, but I will respond. And yeah, I'm happy to continue the conversation.
I appreciate you one being transparent and honest about, some of the examples from yourself as
Yeah.
well. And like I said, being practical with, how people can actually develop their own careers. And that's the beauty of what this podcast should be about, is giving people clear, actionable insights. And try it, don't try it. Let us know how it goes. Let's see. But it's been a pleasure, and thank you genuinely for joining.
Thank you, Eden. And it's been my privilege and pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye.